be very important to see the screen during your presentation.
There are slides.
There's some exciting photos. You don't want to miss them.
Well, of course. Dina didn't want to see my. Well, I know.
Get a little closer to the
Yeah.
screen because I don't have the eyes.
Okay. Jamie, can you hear us? Oh yeah. Okay. Do you want me?
Oh, I thought you said Leslie was gonna.
Yeah, but do you want to like?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone, to the February Roundtable discussion by the EBS committee. Today we have the distinct privilege of having a presenter who wrote the actual paper that we're going to be going over today, as well as an illustrious slate of discussants.
Susan, welcome.
And yes, so Kelsey will be presenting, Dr. Kumar will be presenting on a paper actually that she has written with a bunch of other people, including some authors in this room. And she'll be presenting on one of the projects that she did before. So I think typically what we do is we try to, we can handle it however folks want to, but typically we try to have the presenter go through everything and then save ample time at the end for sort of interdisciplinary discussion, variety of people giving a variety of perspectives. Actually, it's one of the aspects of the roundtable that we've robustly and routinely received feedback that people enjoy. So we want to be sure to save time for that at the end. Then you said, Leslie, we'll start off with a background or?
Yeah. So let me just quickly introduce our great panel that we have today. So on Zoom with us is Ellen Wright. She is a parent partner with Child and Family Service. So she's going to be part of the discussion, as well as Dr. Jamie Hernandez Armstrong. She's the clinical lead out at East White Family Guidance Center. And then in the room with us here is Dr. Phil Sheehan, clinical lead at Honolulu Family Guidance Center. So that's the four of us. We're going to be talking about this really fun paper. But to kind of situate us in kind of where all of this lives with regard to CAMD, Dr. Leslie Slavin is going to give us a quick introduction about how this paper and this framework situates with where CAMD has been and where we're headed in the future. So
yeah, I'm going to try to do that. So, hi, everybody. We were just talking yesterday about the idea that I could talk a little bit about the CAMD and our relationship to this idea of distillation and modular therapy, which I think most of you are familiar with more the terms, the practice element approach. And so I was reminiscing about coming to CAMD in 2003, at which time Bruce Trapita was both a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the psychology department and also part-time clinical director of CAMHD. So that he actually hired me, and it was during the Felix era, we often call it, coming, sort of fighting our way out of this consent decree. And a lot of what Bruce focused on during his time with CAMHD was trying to really provide an evidence-based approach for our all of our services, and tried to make sure that the new services put in place through the Felix consent decree, reflected the evidence base. So when I started coming to the EBS committee, I think Brad was a grad student probably.
That was Albert.
Yeah.
He looked the
Yeah.
same.
That was Albert.
He looked shorter.
Yeah.
And it was actually a big group. Camden was flying psychiatrists and psychologists over from the neighbor islands to attend. So anyway, a lot of what we were doing is coding articles that were like the randomized controlled trial articles that helped to develop the blue menu, which is our menu of what actually works as far as manualized approaches. And then we started coding manuals for the presence of practice elements. And I guess really Bruce and his colleague Eric DeLeiden started that and kind of developed this coding for the manuals. But a number of us coded articles and larger manuals that included these approaches. So that was really the beginning of the distillation approach that we're still talking about. I was looking on my computer today to figure out when other milestones were reached. And in 2005, the MTPS was introduced. So that's the monthly treatment progress summary that was completed by providers and continued to be completed by providers until the introduction of MAX about a year ago. But the MTPS included describing what you're doing, utilizing practice elements and treatment targets. In 2009, so 4 years later, we got a new division chief. We were out of the Felix consent decree. I think Stan Michaels, our division chief at that time, had no particular tie to this work that Shorpita did. And there were some concerns that we paid a lot of money to this guy who took the information and kind of made a lot of money off of it. And so there was just this little quiet corner of us continuing, I think, to utilize the practice elements and to try to do research on them. And Chuck Miller and his lab really went forward pretty much full steam ahead, validating that the progress ratings are related to other kind of progress indices, and that what happens in sessions actually matches what people say happened. There's just a lot of very fundamental research that was done during those years about that. So around that time, we stopped contracting with Bruce, but we continued to kind of utilize the work and watch what was happening in his business practice-wise, kind of from afar. Another important date, I think, is that in 2015, the practice management group of CAMD really made some decisions to retain the practice element approach in the new system. So we were like creating new forms, the clinical management plan form and the mental health treatment plan form and the new progress note form, all of which utilize the idea of practice elements and treatment targets. So at this point, this modular approach, the distillation lens, it's all baked into the cake of how CAMD practices. I think we have a long way to go to really utilize it as much as we could. So hopefully Kelsey's going to help us, head in that direction. I think our staff don't know as much about the practice elements and treatment targets and this whole approach as they need to know. Our providers don't know as much as they need to know. But I think once we all get up to speed and we have these beautiful data, we're really going to be in a great position to utilize them, to make treatment better for kids and families, which is what matters. I will stop there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's really helpful. So I think that gives us a really nice overview. I don't present well in the chair. That gives us a really nice overview of kind of where CAMD has been and where it's headed in terms of this approach to conceptualizing treatment. And just quickly going over our agenda today, what we're going to be talking about, and then we'll have a discussion on, is understanding this framework within the larger context of youth psychosocial treatment. We'll talk about the public health problem that I see, and then what the real problem is related to this public health problem. We'll jump into the study and then the implications for research, CAMD practice, clinical practice, and then we'll jump into our discussion. So just quickly going over our objectives for today, because you guys are, some of you are earning CE credit, so just to be aware, our objectives are to understand the framework and definition of practice elements and how they relate to evidence-based treatment. I'm hoping that you'll get a clear distinction of how they're very unique after this talk. Identify problem areas that may need more efficacy or effectiveness research, and that's really the historical perspective that we looked at. And then compare historical practice element trends to existing CAMD reports and metrics. And specifically for CAMD, staff as well as contracted providers, thinking about how this paper really relates to the kinds of data you're already getting from our system as well as in regular reports. So just a quick disclosure, I am a consultant for PracticeWise. I'm a paid consultant. Here I am in 2008 when Brad took over this committee and Bruce left. I think I was like one of the first paid people in PracticeWise because I had to file all of the code sheets into the filing cabinet in our old East-West Center filing cabinet, right? And I did that for about 5 years, I think, throughout my pre-bac time. And then I also serve on the practice development and distance learning development team now. So if you're ever on PracticeWise and you look at all of the PowerPoint and the videos, I help to develop those, as well as still continue to code articles. So as Leslie was mentioning, this is a grassroots effort within Hawaii, and so really near and dear to a lot of the people in this room, as well as my heart. And a little bit more about me. So I trained under Dr. Brad Nakamura at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My research really focuses on youth psychopathology, psychometrics, and implementation science, and hopefully you'll get a taste of what that is. It's really understanding the systematic study of interventions into community settings, so understanding the process behind that, and I think you'll glean a lot of that in my take-home messages related to where we're headed next for CAMHD. And I did my postdoctoral training at the University of Pennsylvania. I was in this amazing postdoc setting where I got to work for the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services, and that's the city's public mental health authority, and we owned our own private managed care organization called Community Behavioral Health. So that's where I sat in community behavioral health, and I sat in the evidence-based practice and innovation center, Shana Banana, which was a two-person center that was really focused on effectively implementing evidence-based treatments into our community settings. So you're harnessing implementation science in order to get these treatments into our large kind of public sector healthcare system. And community behavioral health was the only Medicaid serving agency within the city of Philadelphia, so we serve millions of consumers. clinically, I am an anxiety treatment person, so I studied under Brad under Bruce, and so we come from a long line of anxiety treatment researchers and practitioners. I got to do my pre-doctoral internship at Iolalahui, and so I did it in the Pu'uvai Native Hawaiian Health, Native Hawaiian Behavioral Health in Molokai, as well as Waimanalo Health Center. So I'm really interested in integrated behavioral health, rural mental health, and also in postdoc, I got to train with some really fabulous folks like Edna Foa and Marty Franklin and Aaron Beck. All were treatment developers within Philadelphia. So really cool setting. So that gives you some background that what I'm about to say is hopefully founded by some experience and research. Okay, so what is the public health problem? We know that 20% of youth will suffer from some kind of mental health concern by the age 18, so 1 in 5. So if you put Brad's children and my children together, there's the base rate is kind of high. We have 6 children altogether if we had to like add them all. And so one of them might suffer from some kind of mental health concern, and that varies, right, in terms of what kinds of mental health concerns we see. But we do know that it's a high rate, and especially in community mental health settings, the youth kiddos that receive care will receive care that's potentially not informed by any kind of evidence, or they won't receive any care at all. And so we're embarking in this kind of in this health care world where treatment efficacy research, like these randomized controlled trials that are really trying to test the best treatments for kids. My back is sore, so I'm really sorry, Albert. The treatment efficacy research, are you okay?
Yeah.
Do you need some water? Okay. Treatment efficacy research continues to grow, and providers are continuing to try to meet an ever-growing need. So the Institute of Medicine considers this kind of this quality chasm, right? Like, so when you think about the treatment developers kind of on this factory end, you're continually trying to refine and create all these treatments, and then in the actual community setting, there's a bunch of practitioners doing the best that they can in terms of implementing these evidence-based practices, and that funnel is really tiny, right? And so the idea behind bridging that gap is to really start to look at what are some of those effective strategies and processes that we can use in order to bring some of those research into actual practice. And so the Institute of Medicine calls that the research to practice gap. There's been numerous studies citing that it's a 17 to 20-year odyssey in terms of getting priorities for research funding all the way down to practice. So it's a long, long road. Does anybody know who that fancy guy is?
Scurvy?
Scurvy, Charles Lynn. Yes, you do.
Citrus.
Yes, citrus fruit, exactly. So that's Charles Lynn. He was a naval a naval physician, and he is famous for conducting potentially the first clinical trial. And what he did was he studied how citrus fruits would help with symptoms of scurvy, and that started in 1947. One of his journeys was actually to Kealakekua Bay, which was really cool when I was reading about this. 1747, that's when he did this first kind of randomized controlled trial where he separated, some sailors from the other sailors to see if the citrus would work, and it did. But it wasn't implemented into routine clinical practice, routine Navy practice until 1794. So that's a 47-year gap. And so when we're thinking about these research to practice gaps, or just kind of these, this lag in getting the research to practice, it's not uncommon. This happens all the time, and it's been happening for decades and even centuries. And so when you think about this research to practice gap in terms of our goal here in CAMD and meeting kiddos with mental health concerns, our real goal is to effectively disseminate and implement evidence-based treatments to youth and their families, right? And this is our main goal in order to help some of the community to help meet the unmet need and to bridge that research to practice gap. Now, there are a number of different barriers that could influence the extent to which evidence-based treatments are implemented within community settings, and there's a whole body of growing research that I'm really excited about that looks at the implementation, especially within children's community mental health. And so I'm really excited because that is where my passion is, and a lot of the research really started in this area. And we know that implementation is a multi-contextual and basic process. So it doesn't happen, you're not ever done implementing something, right? So when you think about implementation, you can think of it as kind of this longitudinal process. It doesn't start and it doesn't end. It kind of ebbs and flows and it keeps going, but it's kind of this process that you're kind of continually refining. It's iterative and it's long, and this slide really details kind of the number of interconnected and equally important structures that need to be considered prior to implementation. So when you think about financial structures, you're thinking about policy and as well as reimbursement type structures that hinder incentives in order to use evidence-based treatments. There's also little policies and mandates that often do not capitalize on behavioral principles. So you see this in a lot of systems where they mandate the use of certain practices. And oftentimes what you see because of that is this kind of hammer and nail effect, that they're just gonna use all these, say they're gonna use all these evidence-based treatments because that's what you're supposed to be using without really discerning the extent to which it applies to that actual kiddo, or if it's really, being effective and it's really helping. Nested within that is organizational culture and leadership, therapist knowledge, attitudes, and self-efficacy, and youth and family characteristics. So when you're thinking about implementation, if these things are considered kind of after the intervention is designed, you can think of implementation as already kind of falling behind because you're already kind of creating this tool or you're creating this package without kind of conceptualizing the context under which you're going to implement something. And specifically related to youth mental health, therapist knowledge, attitudes, and self-efficacy is probably one of the highest areas that is studied in terms of trying to effectively implement evidence-based treatment. So that might be in the way of training, it might be in the way of supervision, but a lot of the research has amassed in this kind of one domain of implementation. So if you've been in this system long enough, you've heard the story of John. John Young is one of Bruce Torpedo students. I think he was in Brad's cohort too. And you've heard the story about him, looking for being a new therapist, finding these manuals, realizing that he needs a number of different manuals in order to effectively treat the community that he's going to see. And then we soon see that John kind of leaves us because he's so overwhelmed with the amount of information that he has to process with books. We're in a slightly different time. So John, these pictures, these photos from like 2005, Brad-ish?
Yeah, they're pretty old.
2005, so almost 15 years ago. And I would say that we are in a fairly different time in terms of how we gather information and how we make decisions. And so I want to offer you guys the story of Keith. So this is Keith Izawa. He is a newly licensed social worker, not very new, but newly licensed. He looks so excited, right? He just got his license. And he's facing the same issue. He is really excited to be a new therapist, and he wants to find more information on how to treat the kiddos that he's going to see in the community. So what does he do? He goes on his computer. And he goes on Google, in fact, because Google is this is how he makes decisions about anything. He Googles anything. And so what he's Googling is ADHD resources for therapists. And so what he wants to find is the best resources for ADHD in order to help the kiddos that he's about to see. And what does he get? He gets about 80 million results in less than a second. So he's like, okay, well, I'm gonna look at a few websites to see what information I can glean and, if I can find common themes. And soon he's opening all these different websites and he doesn't quite know what to make of all this information. So he's just kind of looking at all these websites, trying to find the best resources, and finally, guess what? He gives up. He's just done. And so this is a common happening, and I would say then that the real problem, that's how he looks almost every day at the end of the day. He's just like, I'm done.
You have the same face all the time.
Yeah, that's pretty much what he does every day. He's just like, oh, I'm done. But the real problem then is that therapists are facing an oversaturation of information and need coordinated knowledge management systems in order to help them make decisions about different kinds of practices. And so one such way that we can do that is looking at the distillation and matching model. So this is a lot what Leslie was talking about. I'm going to jump into it and do a very brief overview of the distillation and matching model, just to understand kind of where these practice elements and these treatment targets came from within our CAPG system of care. So what distillation refers to is identifying these techniques or components or practices within these treatment manuals or protocols. It does rely on a couple assumptions, which I'll get to in a second. The matching part is summarizing based upon client setting, contextual factors, and contextual factors that help with treatment decision making. And the idea behind the DMM, or the distillation and matching model, is that there's less empirical burden for treatment developers to continually test and refine manuals. So we are getting these kind of discrete practices that are not kind of brand name, but they are kind of frequent and consistent across all these different treatments. And so when we think about practice elements, these are these discrete clinical techniques or strategies used as a part of a larger intervention plan. So this table shows from Bruce and Eric and John's 2005 paper about the distillation and matching model. It shows an example of what a practice element is. And it's based on three really important assumptions: that each of these practices can be explicitly defined so that every person who's kind of looking at a particular practice can define it in the same way, that you can code the presence in various interventions reliably. So there's kind of this effort to be very careful and very methodical about how you identify these practices. And that these different treatments, these different treatment protocols share these common practice elements. And so I'll go through an example in a second. So the practice elements are coded from existing treatments taken from randomized controlled trials. And that's what, Leslie was mentioning earlier. Those are the randomized controlled trials and then the subsequent treatment manuals that we started coding many, many years ago. So just a quick example of this. I'm an anxiety person, so I always love this example. So you see the coping cat manual, the OCD, the POTS manual, and then coping koala, which is in Australia, right?
Yeah.
Coping koala, right?
They're
And
all dead now in the fire.
that was, wow, you
So
took it
dark.
there.
Oh.
Wow. You took it
They're
there.
not. They're not. I'm just joking.
That's a little morbid, man.
We're coping.
Okay,
We're coping.
great. Great. Okay. So,
We're coping.
but when we're thinking about practice, God, that's so morbid. When we're thinking about practice, she made them darker koalas then. When we're thinking about practice elements within these treatment manuals, the idea is that all of these listed under here, exposure, cognitive, psychoeducation, relaxation, etc., you can reliably code the presence or absence of these practices within the treatment manual and then across the treatment manual. And that's the idea behind the practice elements. Quickly touching on what matching does. Matching is based upon setting, client, and other contextual factors. And so it pulls together these practice element profiles. So you notice kind of these bars may look similar to things that you see within our provider reports and our annual reports, and that you hear about within CAMD about these blue bars. Kind of exactly the same thing when we're looking at, what is the frequency with which these practices have been shown in this group of treatment manuals or randomized controlled trials that we've coded over time. And then the matching part goes into looking at specific contextual factors. So for example, if you're looking for a specific anxiety disorder like specific phobia, and then you're looking at a specific ethnicity like Hispanic, or race like Hispanic, or ethnicity like Asian, Black, or Caucasian, you're able to drill down based upon these parameters in order to see what practices have been most frequent within these treatment protocols. So this distillation methodology really identifies these discrete practices regardless of treatment manual, and coordinates based on problem area and not by diagnosis. So you saw in this last slide that you're looking at anxiety disorders and you can drill down to specific phobias, or you can drill down to specific diagnoses, but we're really coding up at that problem area level. And that's what's really kind of different about the distillation methodology. And I think it's important to note here that there's often common assumptions about these practice elements that is really important to clarify. So I would note that these practice elements, while robust in terms of the frequency, standing alone, they are not evidence-based practices, or they're not evidence-based treatment, right? So we can say that exposure is available in about 90% of all anxiety protocols. Exposure in it by itself is not an evidence-based practice element or an evidence-based treatment. And so it's really important to make that distinction, because I think we often think that because the frequency is high, it's evidence-based, but that's not the case, and that's definitely not what this methodology does. Another thing to note is that practice elements are core components. I hear people say that often, like that these are the core components of treatment protocols or treatment manuals. And I think Brad's maybe dissertation, your sequencing paper, was that your dissertation, right? Like, I think there's some research that has really started to look at, the sequencing or the timing that looks into this idea of core elements, but we don't have enough research with regard to the actual practice. We don't have enough research within the smaller discrete practice elements to say that these are the core or the main ingredients of any kind of active treatment. So it's really important to note that. Yes. Okay. So when you're thinking about coordinated knowledge management systems and you're thinking about distillation methodology, what exactly does a coordinated knowledge management system look like? I'm going to give you a glimpse into one. I'm going to tell you, in my humble opinion, that it's probably, it could be better. But this is the first crack at putting together a coordinated knowledge system. So this is the Practice-Wise Evidence-Based Services Database, PWEBS. And so for folks who have seen this in some way, shape, or form, it's a kind of online database that you're able to look up various treatments, youth treatments, treatment protocols, and you can search them based on the different parameters that you want to put in. So like we mentioned earlier, if we wanted to look for anxiety treatments that correspond to a strength of evidence that we're looking for, and strength of evidence corresponds to like the American Psychological Association or American Academy of Pediatrics kind of levels of support. You can look that up, and then you get a summary of treatment families as well as practice elements. So you can see the frequency under which these practice elements kind of emerged in the in the treatment protocols, as well as the number of treatment protocols, the actual manuals, and the number of papers that were coded to make up that sample. So this is kind of a first kind of a step towards bringing together a coordinated knowledge management system that really starts to help distill and make the literature more user-friendly for therapists out in the field. Okay, so that transitions us to the current study, which is our study that we looked at. And really what we wanted to understand was, well, when we're thinking about this large mass of treatment, youth psychosocial treatment, especially within these different problem areas, what has the change been over time? Are we looking at dramatic changes over time, or have things been relatively stable over time? Because our coordinated knowledge system is great, and we needed to know the extent to which, there's been historical change over time that might affect the way that we deliver treatment. So the aims of our study were to leverage the distillation methodology to examine the innovation patterns within youth psychosocial literature, to understand the growth rate of treatment studies relative to practice elements. So we wanted to see how many randomized controlled trials are happening and how many practice elements are being identified over the years. And then we wanted to compare growth within and across problem areas to enhance clinical practice. So all towards the goal of trying to improve how we distill knowledge down to therapists. So the method we used the practice-wise evidence-based services database. We chose, our sample was 586 randomized controlled trials, and this represented studies published between 1966 to 2016. I think that's 50 years. I'm so bad at math.
Yeah.
50 years. Across 11 youth problem areas, and when we needed to choose, when there were multiple treatment protocols within the problem area, we chose the earliest one. And we considered a treatment protocol or a treatment manual to win if it was statistically superior to another treatment, waitlist, or no treatment on a group by time interaction or a between group test at post-treatment. So very similar to other kind of outcome related studies. We just looked at, did they beat waitlist or did they beat another active treatment? Oldest. First one, yes. That's a good question. Okay, so this is our data set, and this comes out of the paper that was sent out to you guys. So this is the total number of randomized controlled trials, protocols, which are treatment manuals, the number of practice elements. The first trial, the first year the trial was published, and the mean number of RCTs per year. The anxiety and disruptive behavior problems were studied the most frequently, with 150 and 149 studies respectively, whereas suicide, mania, and eating disorders had the least amount of randomized controlled trials. And we start to notice that a lot of these problem areas have been studied for different lengths of time. So disruptive behavior, anxiety, and attention and hyperactivity were the earliest problem areas for which there were published RCTs, with the first treatments emerging in the 1960s, whereas some of the other problem areas only started to be researched and developed within the 80s and the 2000s. Likely has a lot to do with kind of our conceptualization of problems, changes in the DSM, as well as changes in, the types of treatments and the modalities that we see. And despite being, examined for equivalent lengths of time, some areas have more published RCTs than others. So studies of trauma and eating disorders started roughly around the same time, so 1996 and 1994, but you can see a stark difference between the number of RCTs within traumatic stress versus eating disorders. And this likely had to do with a lot of funding priorities as well, right? So this is around the time where the federal government started to really prioritize trauma-informed systems of care and pushed out a lot of those NCTSN grants to these statewide systems. And a similar pattern emerged in disruptive behavior, anxiety, and tension and hyperactivity, whereas attention and hyperactivity began a few years after studies of disruptive behavior and anxiety, yet disruptive behavior and anxiety were addressed in almost 3 times as many studies. So you can see that, there have been several different priorities related to what's being studied and how frequently things are being studied. So just really interesting findings in terms of the actual overall sample. Next few slides get into the actual growth within each problem area, and this is where things get really kind of interesting for us, I think. So when we start to look at anxiety, well, just to orient you to this actual slide, what we're looking at is the solid line goes over the number of treatment protocols. So that's the number of kind of studies or manuals that have been happening throughout the years. And you can see in 2016, when we ended our sample, there was about 136 protocols. And then the dotted line, the dashed line, corresponds to the number of practice elements. So you can see that there's a very different kind of change over time. There's a very different growth rate related to practice elements relative to the number of studies that happen. So you see a bump in the late 90s related to practice element innovation around 1997. And this likely has to do with, variations in the modality of treatment for anxiety. So I think around the early 2000s, you saw changes in how anxiety treatments were being delivered, so online, in groups, things like that, and that's likely what you're seeing there. I think, since about 2011-ish, there's been a real different change in terms of the causal mechanisms behind exposure, this idea behind, emotional processing theory versus inhibitory learning. And you see another change, another kind of spike in how many practice elements there are. So I think there are, very different kind of changes that impact the growth under which the treatment protocols happen versus the practice elements. Similarly, for disruptive behavior, we're seeing kind of the same trend where the practice elements kind of have slowed over the past 2 decades, but disruptive behavior protocols continue to proliferate, and that again likely has to do with modality changes and changes in the way that we're delivering treatments to kiddos. Specifically for attention and hyperactivity, we see a continuous accumulation of PEs relative to studies. And it's really important to note here, especially given the expertise in the room related to some of the treatments that are more pharmacological in nature for ADHD, that these studies only focus on youth psychosocial treatment, but I think we've been seeing a lot of really great work, by Bill Pelham and folks about the sequencing of ADHD treatment relative to medication trials, and that's why you're starting to see some different kind of changes within the practice elements as the research kind of changes with regard to the timing and the sequencing of ADHD treatment. So that could be relevant here. Notable for depression was the later onset for the study of this problem area in youth, and that's likely dictated again by funding priority changes and changes especially within diagnostic classification systems. So we know, there's a big shift in terms of diagnostic classification from DSM to DSM with regard to some of these more internalizing concerns in diagnosed in youth and adolescents, and you're likely seeing the changes based upon that. One thing to note about the first 4 problem areas that we went over, anxiety, disruptive behavior, attention, hyperactivity, and depression, which I like to think of as the big 4. Like when you think about these 4 major problem areas, a lot of the shift in the research literature and treatment efficacy research was a lot to do with having treatments being person-centered focused towards a more youth ecological focus. And so you're likely seeing a lot to do with changes in clinical formulation as well as a more biopsychosocial framework when conceptualizing treatment moving forward. This is the figure for autism protocols, and you can see not a lot of movement within, the first couple of decades in terms of treatment, but you see a kind of big uptick within the 2000s, likely to do with a lot of, there's been a lot of movement in terms of a lot of public health campaigns around autism spectrum disorder as well as treating autism spectrum disorder. And so you're likely seeing a lot of that kind of consumer-driven kind of movement there. Same with substance use disorders, you're seeing a lot more practice elements relative to treatment protocols.
That's interesting.
This kind of suggests to me that the research is still kind of out in terms of the best ways to treat substance use. And I think the difficulty here is picking apart the different kinds of substance use disorders and the different kinds of treatments and how that really impacts the ecological how that impacts youth ecologically. Go ahead.
It's also about the substance use community being anti-research and, really not supporting research evidence.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the controlled drinking, you remember the whole controlled drinking controversy? You guys are too young. Well,
there's controlled drinking.
There's a whole controlled drinking approach that has been shown to be pretty effective for certain people with alcoholism. Basically people whose addiction hasn't gone to a certain level can become controlled drinkers. But there was a huge backlash against the researchers who did that.
But they were vindicated.
Huh?
They were vindicated.
They were vindicated because they're correct.
Yeah.
But, you had,
Like a harm reduction.
Oh, like a harm reduction.
well, basically,
Interesting.
60 Minutes went to the grave of somebody that died from alcoholism, and there a whole backlash against the researchers by the kind of religious 12-step folks,
Right.
who are just committed to
Right.
that approach.
Mm-hmm.
And
I hope you're talking about adults.
yeah, it was a treatment for adults primarily.
Right.
But I don't know. Anyway, I just think that's probably why we don't see a big uptick.
What's the backlash in relation to you?
Not particularly, but I think you would have a similar group of, I think, we know that 12-step work doesn't work for adolescents, but we still have people practicing it all the time. We're just not willing to look at this.
Sure.
Anyway.
That's a really good, that's a really good point. Yeah. So this is traumatic stress. We talked about this a little bit. The practice elements are above the number of treatment protocols. And I think we're starting to see an uptick in the research there, likely to do with funding priorities again and kind of what's being funded. That's the same thing. Elimination is pretty interesting. We haven't seen any growth in treatment practice elements, probably since about the early 90s. And what was really interesting to see is that the last research study was in 2009. So this is an area that we can probably learn from a little bit because people have stopped researching, in this area. And I think we have potentially pretty good treatments for elimination disorders, enuresis and copresis. And so thinking about, what shifted in terms of the priorities and how people really kind of put where the efforts have gone since then is worth looking into. This is eating disorders, not a lot of research here, so only 10 treatment protocols, but still a lot of practice elements. And the same for suicide here. So not a lot of treatment protocols, but a lot of practice elements. And I think, you're seeing this a lot, especially for eating disorders and suicide because of the complexity of these problem areas. And it's really difficult, I would say, to treat and to effectively study some of this in a controlled way because of the lethality of these disorders and how medically complicated they can be for some, especially for kiddos. And so I think one thing that really kind of stood out for me for these last two slides is, thinking about how we study and learn about disorders through novel methodology. And so there's been a lot in terms of developing different kinds of research methods to tailor treatments in a way that you can study responders to treatments through kind of sequential and multiple assignment randomized trials. And so you get to kind of watch how they respond and then randomize them to different groups in order to see, as people get better or get worse, trying to figure out how, looking at the relative change there compared to other kiddos in those same kinds of groups. And so thinking about that idiographic assessment and personalized medicine to really start to look at how we can study these, especially these areas needing a little bit more research. So what are the implications? Again, like we talked about, mania, suicide, eating disorders require much, much more research. And I think, especially for us in CAMHD, when we're seeing these problem areas present clinically, I think that gives us that should cue us that, this area or this kiddo might require a little bit more monitoring and a careful approach just to understand kind of, what's going on and understanding the nuances behind the treatment that you're going to provide. And for the big four, the treatment practices have remained relatively stable and should follow kind of a predictable path in terms of anxiety, those kinds of treatments. And particularly when you're thinking about this distillation methodology or this practice element or treatment problem area approach, therapists should start to address a targeted problem area at the start of treatment, and that should be your kind of goalpost. That's kind of what you're always kind of coming back to when you're treating a particular problem area, a particular kid. But we also know that our CAMDUs do not present with these kind of mutually exclusive problem areas. So you often don't see kiddos with just an anxiety disorder or just a dissociative behavior disorder. They're often multimorbid. They have complex ecologies, and there's a lot of kind of fuzziness in terms of how they're presenting. So that's important to recognize. Leslie touched a little bit on what we've done in CAMD thus far, so I won't go into this too much. We've adopted this framework. We've integrated a lot of this into our reporting. We've implemented this case management system. We are currently still implementing this case management system. We've standardized outcome monitoring, and we've set a foundation for clinical co-management. And we've really defined evidence-based practice within our system through this 4 evidence-based approaches. So just a reminder, when you look at the Teal Book and when you think about the CAMD4 evidence bases, that comprises of the general services research, which is a lot of what we're talking about today. case-specific historical information that's kind of monitoring outcomes over time, local aggregate evidence, that's if you're going to kind of aggregate all of the really rich information within our system or within a level of care or within an FGC or within a clinical lead about kind of what's really helping with that specific group of kiddos, and then causal mechanism research. So looking at what are some mediators or moderators that might affect different kinds of outcomes within treatment. So that's how we define evidence-based practices within CAM-HD, and it's pretty similar, but I would say very kind of a lot more nuanced towards, it's pretty similar to well-adopted definitions of evidence-based practice, but it's way more specific in terms of how we want to conceptualize evidence-based practice and how we want to monitor outcomes. So just a quick note on this. Brad's laughing at me because he knows I completely stumbled on that. It's important to note here that how we define EBP continues to evolve from the APA Task Force statement in 2005 to the recent Coalition for the Advancement of Application and of Psychological Science, CAPS, in 2018. So this is from, Sackett, which is based in evidence-based medicine. It's the idea that evidence-based practice is this three-legged stool. It's the integration of clinical research with clinical experience and patient preferences. And in my humble opinion, I feel like I've given this, I've talked about this in several different talks I've given recently because it's so important. In my humble opinion, evidence-based practice is not a verb, not a noun, it's a verb. It's an ongoing process that's integrating the clinical experience, the clinical research, and patient preferences. And it's not synonymous with terms like evidence-based treatment, empirically supported treatments, and well-established treatments. So it's really hard because they all sound similar when you think about evidence-based treatment and empirically supported treatment. And then when you think about evidence-based practice, you tend to kind of glob them all together. But I think it's really important to make the distinction here that evidence-based practice is kind of this iterative process. And that's really important as we're starting to define what this means for our CAMD population and our staff. So what's next for CAM-HD? This is where I get a little bit provocative, I think, in terms of my thinking and what I kind of see as our next priorities within CAM-HD. So I would say one of the first things we need to start doing is asking for data that helps you make decisions about co-managing care. And this is really, it's a small statement, but it's a really time-intensive process when you think about it. So I would urge folks to think about and ask specifically for data that you need, and to take time and think through what you actually need in order to make decisions about co-managing care. And if the data are not meeting your needs, then ask again, and then ask again. Because we can't get it right without any feedback, and it's really important to hear what data you need. And I think we have ideas here in Division about what data would be most meaningful for you, but we won't know until you take some time and think about it too, so that's really important. The next thing is to think beyond treatment dashboards for measuring change, measuring clinical change. So I think we're at this really important juncture within electronic health records and co-managing care, that it's time to really harness the power of technology to leverage clinical decision-making through real-time notification, workflows, and business process flows within the system to create habit formation, right? Like when we think about decision-making, it happens through two avenues. It happens through habit formation, which is kind of this unconscious avenue, and then goal-directed, which is a very kind of logical way to informed decisions. And if you ask people how they make decisions, they will always give you the logical answer. But if they haven't formed a habit around making a decision, they will almost always use emotion to make their decision. And so the biggest emotion that can happen when you give clinical tools is the feeling of frustration and not understanding how to use it. And so it's really important to make things that are really easy for people to use, not necessarily simple, but really easy for them to use. And it shouldn't require a lot of information or directions to use it. It should be really intuitive, and that's the kind of world that we're living in right now. And so helping with that would be a more kind of formative evaluation to understand the complex processes to make tools and to make flows and make technology work for you in a way that's helping you make those treatment decisions. Another thing is developing a method for tracking treatment adaptations. So we don't understand treatment adaptations, especially emergent life events, enough, and we don't provide guidance on how to navigate these events. Rather, we're focused on how to deliver therapy, and instead, I would argue that we're in community behavioral health, and that the biggest thing we're going to train on, the biggest thing that we're going to have to co-manage care on is how to address adaptation. And so if we don't train specifically for how to track that, as well as move around adaptation and grapple with these things, we're missing the mark completely. I would improve outcome monitoring by integrating measurement and feedback. So I know we've done a lot of work on the Ohio scales in terms of getting that out back to our end users in order to show them, how their kiddos are doing. And so I would integrate the measurement and the feedback system into that as well. The other thing I would argue is next is to identify classes of complex cases and predictors of change using non-parametric methods to unearth kind of latent classes and using machine learning to understand clusters of youth who respond similarly and differently in treatment. And we need to refine those models constantly. So we can't rely on kind of this lag in terms of using archival data, and we have to continually use AI to really understand what are these kind of complex models within our system and try to model change within treatment trajectories. I would codify the 4 evidence-based decision tree from the ground up. So evaluating the current efforts of providers and staff in utilizing the 4 evidence bases. And here I would think more about what the latent construct is and measure it. So is it treatment decision-making? Is it outcome monitoring? And understanding what that is and calling these out, focusing the efforts in defining and disseminating champions and instances of utilizing the 4 evidence bases in clinical care and calling these out constantly and shaping these behaviors up in order to understand, what is it exactly that we want? What does that exactly look like from the ground up? What does it look like when a care coordinator is using the 4 evidence bases? And so I think doing a grounded approach will help us really understand what it is that we're actually targeting and what we're shooting for. Another thing I think we need is a lot more mixed methods research and evaluation. So creating an avenue for ongoing refinement of the system through open communication, starting with the people kind of on the ground, serving our kids as well as the kiddos and the youth that we see in the family. So making their voices the most important voice in the system and understanding kind of their perspective from the ground up. And creating a culture of continuous quality improvement. I feel like that's my favorite one, where we fail fast and we fail often. We have to keep making mistakes and we have to fail in order to learn and to make our system better. And so I think it's really easy to and really terrifying, this idea that we have to continually refine our process. but sometimes we just have to go in and do it and evaluate it so we can change it right away. And so it doesn't matter what kind of plan or method we're going to use in terms of CQI, it just matters that we're doing it. And so starting now, in order to highlight failures for everyone to learn, as well as our successes, is really important, because the goal here is really to get to the point of, behavioral rehearsal and habit formation, especially when it comes to integrating some of these larger kind of system change into the system. Okay, so that's my kind of take. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so those are my thoughts in terms of what's next for CAMHD, but I'm going to open it up to our clinical leads now to give us a little bit more thoughts on kind of the implication and what's next for CAMHD from kind of a co-management perspective. I'll start with Jamie, and then I'll go to Bill, and then we'll hear from Ellen about what it means for our kind of CAMD parent partners.
No pressure. Great job. Thanks, Kelsey. I just want to say this really highlights how really amazing the PracticeWise program is and how much work has been put into that. And you don't really appreciate it until you kind of show it all through, how much work has been done. Even though I've sat on the EBS committee for a short period of time compared to others, I just wanted to say how incredible that is. And I think that this is so important in how we're doing our practice now, especially with MAX, our new electronic medical record system. And I was just talking to my intern my postdoc right here, who's hiding in the corner, about how from all the way from the beginning, from the initial mental health evaluation, we're using these practice elements to determine what the treatment is that each kid is going to get. It maps from their initial mental health evaluation to the clinical management plan to the MHTP that the providers are using. And I just think that, we had talked earlier about it being easier to distill these types of elements to a very diverse array of clients, like you said, who are presenting with comorbid problems, with complex trauma issues, and with very diverse cultural backgrounds. And I think this is the way that the field of psychology is going to end up going. And it's going to help to distinguish us as a field in providing better mental health. Anyway, I don't know. Those are just my thoughts in kind of where we go from here. But I know we had talked about more before, but that's kind of where my thoughts after having listened to your presentation. I don't know if I can add anything else, but that's kind of, I think the hard part of this is going from that initial evaluation to how are the providers actually doing this and overseeing all that. And those are the struggles that I'm seeing now, is meeting with the providers and making sure that that's happening, because I think that they're trying to do that, but when you're actually out in the field and doing that in a home situation where it's maybe very chaotic, there might be multiple changes in who the care providers are, that's what makes it really difficult. And then how do we overcome that barrier? Because now we have our system, our medical record system that it's going to work for, but then once it's going out and actually being used by these providers, how do we help to support them in actually using these practices in these very difficult family situations? And sometimes without a family, sometimes these are foster kids that are bouncing around home, which is even more difficult, right? So, yeah.
That's a really good point. Thanks, Jamie. Bill?
I just have a few thoughts for you. First, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to just say what I think. What I said, this is new to me, right? If I think about it, I finished medical school in 1981. And I went to a hospital for my training, which was run by psychoanalysts, where people laid on couches and talked, and that's 40 years ago. So look what we're talking about here today, right? So it's a huge change, and everybody in our system is somewhere between maybe me and the first person who just came out of school. So the content you're giving is fantastic. And I think it's the future. And I think we just embrace that, and we're lucky to have people like yourselves to tell us about this. We put a lot of resources into the content. I suggest, and I really think we need to have just as much resources, and maybe more, in the process, the implementation. Because you got to have somebody like me, just to take me as an example, being able to use this at the distal end of our organization. When we do an eval and we're doing an initial formulation and we're prescribing treatment, and I've written that CMP where I got those treatment targets, and I put those practice elements in for a kid I've never seen, and I'm doing it for someone who I don't know is going to be the therapist, and then we're sending it off. So we want to do that in a way that either change the model or make that work, right? So I think if we do the process right, and we keep that, it's going to be a long process, but we can learn a lot. We can do this. We can implement it. It can certainly make it better than maybe it was at one point when it was random or just whatever the clinician knew, as opposed to the things that the evidence shows are relevant and the patient preference. So I'm encouraged, actually. I just want, so it's, and everybody's probably in some variation of the spectrum as I am. So that's kind of what I think. I think we should do it. I'm glad we're doing this. I think we should have more meetings like this and keep us all in the loop on a regular basis so that really everybody, it's like I use the model of getting trained in CPR. The first time you go, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. Then you get trained every year. But after a while, if you have to use it, you know it because it's in you. And I'd like it to be in us so that we just use it routinely instead of having to kind of reinvent the wheel every time. So thanks.
Really good point. Ellen?
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Kelsey, for the excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm very happy to be here. And I thank you all for allowing me to also share my thoughts. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of from two hats. Number one, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. And I'm also the program director for the Parent Partner Service. And I'm a parent partner myself because of my own experience having a son on the autism spectrum. So I've gotten to be in a number of domains here, and I'm really very excited about the implications for what this information can help in terms of for the clinicians, the providers of the service, as well as for parents and families, caregivers. So let me just start by saying, when I first started at CAMD, I was a fresh graduate student. I had gone through, I thought, okay, I've completed my practicum, and I was involved in Project Caliho, which is another system of care SAMHSA grant. And I think the greatest gift that I got from that position was going through the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy learning collaborative for a year. And getting that training as a master's student, I really learned so much about the practice and how to have these practice elements and things in a number of different locations and ways to deliver services. So from there, I actually went into being a supervisor for community. Well, I did intensive and home therapy myself, and then I became a supervisor for a community-based organization for mental health, and supervised therapists who were, a lot of them just freshly, graduated from their own programs and had very good, maybe practicum experiences, but community-based mental health was definitely very different for them. And supervising them and making sure that they had the tools to, go into someone's home and work with the family and appropriately be working on strategies and interventions that were going to show some change was a large percentage of what I did within my job. And I can say that this is very exciting, definitely for the co-management of care and working with the providers and making sure that the therapists, the providers have the information and really understand it. When I was a supervisor, I also gave them the therapist that I was supervising at the time, some questionnaires about what did they know about the practice elements, and a lot of them did not. So we spent a good amount of time looking at the discrete practice elements and trying to figure out how to then incorporate that in their plans and their daily practice. As a parent, also with a child who is on the autism spectrum and who is receiving ABA therapy, I can say this is also really great for me, because as a parent, what I really seek to do is to learn skills so that I can, eventually I don't need to have that therapeutic support. And so I think this does 4 things for parents. I think the implementation of using this process in the way that it's designed and where Canvas is going, I think it will help for parents to communicate better. So I have 4 C's. Communicate better, so helping parents to be able to be at treatment team meetings and be speaking the same language as their provider, as the clinical leads, as the care coordinator, so that, if they're talking about, parental praise, for instance, what does that look like? And making sure the parent understands that practice element and what's going on. I think that the second C I would say, and this is the biggest one, is clarity for parents and families regarding the types of skills that they are learning from their provider. So, a big important part of what the therapy is happening in many of these domains is that parents need to learn those skills and need to understand why a certain intervention is happening, why a certain strategy is happening, and how the implementation of that strategy or intervention is going to help them, and if there is a change. So it provides them a sense of strategy, a sense of clarity regarding the services that they are receiving. I think when you have clarity, then you can develop confidence. And you can, that's the third C. So confidence to me is what a lot of our parents are looking for. When they feel clear about what their therapist is asking, what they're doing, then they're able to then join in and take over the reins. And that's where a lot of my parent partners do a lot of the work they are doing. They're working conjointly with therapists and asking the parent, have you implemented this skill? Have you been working on this? They're not teaching those skills because that's the therapist's role, but they're making sure that the parent understands what the skill is, how to implement it, and developing their own sense of confidence and empowerment so that they can go ahead and continue to progress towards positive outcomes. And then, sorry, the fourth C for me is that this information and using the practice elements really helps us to be more concise in addressing family characteristics and the diversity of the problem areas and all of those comorbid concerns. So really making sure that what is happening therapeutically is appropriate for where the family is and their situations, and making sure that it's addressing it. And so I think those 4 really have implications for the parents and the caregivers feeling more confident overall, more skillful, able to communicate, and take more of an active role in the care and the treatment of their children's mental health concerns.
Just have one thing, if I may.
Yeah.
One thing I forgot. I'm sorry for interrupting. I thought about it, and I actually asked Kurt and was approved to use some of my education funds, and I bought PracticeWise. So I bought the year subscription to it and tried to figure it out myself. I could get pretty far, but I think that if I had external support or tutorial or something like that, I found it very interesting and very helpful. And I might be able to implement it on cases. But I think if we're going to use something like that, with getting the system sort of familiar with it and on a regular basis might be helpful. But if there's anybody on the line who's interested in that, I found it very helpful and it's worth it. And I appreciate your support to try it, see what it's like. It's actually a good tool, very good tool.
Absolutely. All right. So I think, if we had to think about the 3 kind of main discussion areas or the 3 takeaways that we're hearing from panelists today is really, that implementation science is kind of, or the process that Bill was mentioning is our critical next step. So really understanding kind of what worked in our system, what hasn't worked, and really understanding kind of how to evaluate these kinds of things in order to make these large systematic changes for our kiddos. Ellen mentioned really important things about strengthening our common language around evidence-based treatment and doing that as a multi-pronged approach and making sure that our lexicon is similar for all people who, that touch this kind of work. So parents, youth, consumers, system partners, as well as our providers and our county staff, that we're using the same terminology and we're using the same language around a lot of these things. And Jamie mentioned a really important thing around making sure that these treatments are really working for the kiddos that we're actually seeing. And one area is really understanding how these treatment adaptations or crises of the weeks are really kind of impacting treatment and figuring out a way to address that moving forward. This QR code will take you to a copy of the actual paper, but I think you guys already have it. It went out with the slides beforehand. So if you have any questions or thoughts, or you're really excited, or you think this work is not so great, please email us. Let us know your thoughts. It's really important that you share it with us, even if it's contrary to what we're believing, because I think, especially for me personally, I operate in this very small bubble. If you've seen my office, it was a padded room previously. I work in a very small bubble. And so I would love to hear different perspectives, because I think I've always heard this perspective, and so it's helpful for me. And just a quick thank you to the panelists, as well as my co-authors there. Trina's in the room, as well as Brad. This paper wouldn't have happened without Bruce Pita or Renat Vitus, as well as Bree Chang. She put together all of the figures that you saw. She worked really hard on putting all those graphs and tables together, and a few other mentors that have really challenged my thinking around this paper in particular. And then that's the rest of our panel. I think we have a time for one question, if people have
Sure,
it.
let's do it. Anybody, any closing questions?
Thoughts?
Susan, take it home.
Susan!
Susan, take it
Yes,
home.
Susan.
So I'm really happy with the presentation. I'm frustrated because it's taken us to come here alone. And parents feel that frustration because our kids are suffering every day. It just seems to take an eternity to get the system up to snuff. And I think we've really made a commitment to families to use the right kind of terminology, but that to me is as important as anything else that you're saying. If you continue to use psycho education and comorbidity around parents, you're going to turn them off for free. So we have to really think like family members and be sensitive to that piece of it, because it's not going to work if we're turning parents off in the process. But I thought it was excellent. Well,
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Thank you, Susan.
It was hard to hear a little bit, Susan, but I think the gist was that, helping families to understand what's going on is just really important. And is that kind of what you were talking about?
yes, and also terminology around families. Let's talk in family-friendly terminology.
Yeah, and something that we're doing with in CAMD that I think is really important and that I think has been really helpful is making sure that as much as possible, the clinical lead can go to any welcome meetings, let the family know this is our role, this is what we do. And I really go to those meetings and explain our services are voluntary and you are the most important part of this treatment team. I tell this to the youth too. This team is for you, and helping them understand and trying not to use acronyms and things like that and explaining acronyms and helping them to feel comfortable if they have questions. It's intimidating to go into a room of like 10 people and not know who any of them are, and the team every time, every month, you know, so I think just that having kind of that touchstone for people to just know that we're a treatment team and you're an important part of that. And I really think our care coordinators try to convey that in meetings as well. And it's something that we really have to still work on, because especially, you know, going to IEP meetings and things like that, it's very intimidating and they're kind of talking gibberish half the time. So I'm glad that you brought that up, and I think it's something we still have to continue working on.
Yeah, I would love to see more of that being done in terms of really making sure that parents understand the services that they're receiving and really understand their role. I think the most successful families that we have and that we are working with, they report to us that when it's made clear, if I do this, if I stick with this, if I'm doing this, then I could see positive outcomes. And when they're shown, you know, when they're shown improvements, when they're shown, oh, you know, this used to be a problem at the beginning of when you entered into, you know, services with CAMD, here, that really goes a long way in terms of increasing the confidence of the families and knowing that what they are doing on a day-to-day basis is making a difference. And sometimes that data needs to come, or that those discussions and that language needs to come during the treatment team meeting so that they can see. But if they haven't been prepared prior about the interventions that are happening and why, you know, the therapist is taking them out, you know, like to the youth out to a park, you know, why is that happening? What are they? And having that understanding is a definite thing that we want to continue to see happen.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, everybody. Special thank you to not only Kelsey, but our illustrious slate of discussants. Thank you very much.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye. Thank you.